But we have a great session to get us started. This morning we're talking about culture. So it is obviously one of the key challenges for the financial services industry going forward. How do we get culture right? As I alluded to yesterday, Ken Hayne, as part of his final report and also in the interim report on the Royal Commission, said that a culture of greed was allowed to develop. And to get organisations back on track, financial services entities will need to grapple with culture, governance and remuneration. But I think it all comes down to culture, really. So joining us to discuss this topic today are three speakers, two of whom are with us in the room and one whom we have some pre-recorded material from. So welcome Jill Klein, Professor of Marketing, Melbourne Business School and Melbourne Medical School. She got her PhD in social psychology from the University of Michigan back in 1990. She splits her time between Melbourne Business School and the Medical School, and her teaching specialties are decision-making, resilience and leadership. And if you were at CMSF last year, hopefully you went to one of her fantastic sessions last year. Sitting next to me is Shundrawn Thomas, who is the President of Northern Trust Asset Management in the United States. He's got that lovely Chicagoan accent. His responsibilities in his new role that he's held for about 18 months or so as the President is developing long-term strategy, executing operating plans, cultivating client relationships, managing vendor relationships and developing talented professionals. So culture certainly has a role to play in that. And then our third speaker, who you will see some answers to questions from, is Professor Graeme Samuel, who you all obviously know as the former chairman of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and president of the National Competition Council. He's now a professorial fellow in Monash University's Business School and School of Public Health and Preventative Medicine. Please make our speakers welcome. So to get us started, I need you all to pull out your mobile phones or your iPads or whatever device you're using to get access to the app. Our polling question is up there for you. Is there a greater emphasis on culture in your fund today than there was 2 years ago? If you could please use the app to do that. You need to go into Arena 1 under the polls and live Q&A for those of you that haven't participated in this before. And for those of you that are waiting that have got your apps out, probably now is a good time to buy a raffle ticket, so don't forget. That's probably not unexpected. What do you think, Jill?
Well, it looks like generally there's been more of an emphasis on culture, but it doesn't seem like it's across the board as much as I might have thought.
Yeah, maybe the question we should be asking is, should we be putting a greater emphasis on culture than we were 2 years ago? Does it surprise you, Shundrawn?
Well, I don't think the responses are a surprise. My sense is if you unpack the responses, you'd probably find is that we're putting different emphasis on culture because in most instances, I think culture has always been very important. But in terms of how we think about it, especially in terms of how it addresses some of the challenges that we see in the marketplace today, different approaches.
All right, so I might just ask you each very quickly, why do you think culture is important?
I would say the culture is very important because it lets us know how to behave. It lets us know what's acceptable, what's valued, what's not valued. I mean, culture by definition is the objects, the practices, the behaviors that are seen as normal or appropriate in a given setting. And as human beings, we often are pretty unsure of ourselves. We look around, we're not sure what we're supposed to do or what we're not supposed to do. And so a key thing that we do is we look at other people to see what they're doing. And we get that from the culture. So if you come into a new organization and certain types of behavior are deemed okay and you observe that, then you'll take on those behaviors. Because we often, we come into a situation we don't know what's the right thing to do.
Shundrawn?
Yeah, the way I think about it is, as a starting point, I mean, we're social beings, and we're really, in a sense, designed to work in community. And if you think about achieving anything great, it comes by virtue of working together with others. So how do you do that? Part of that is understanding a culture, to the points Jill was making, saying what's important, what are our shared values, beliefs, and that does influence how, yes, we behave, but ultimately how we work together to accomplish things collectively that we could not do individually. And so having a healthy culture creates not only safety for us, but it actually creates the opportunity, again, to really accomplish great things if we work well together.
Okay, well, we might bring in Graeme Samuels now, and in answering the question, how does he define culture?
Organisational culture is the fundamental vision and beliefs of the organisation as to how they operate their business, how they interact with all the relevant stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, and shareholders. It's the way they fundamentally believe that the business ought to be viewed by all their stakeholders. And it's not a question of only viewing it, because that's an issue of perception. It's also a case of reality. How is it that those that are dealing with the business deal with it in reality? How do they come out of their dealings in their understanding of how the organisation believes it ought to operate?
Do you have a different view or a slightly different take on it, Jill?
Well, I like his delineation there of what the culture actually is and how it's actually perceived, because there's often a big gap between those two things. The way human memory works is we tend to notice things that are surprising or particularly interesting. We remember those more, we talk about them more. And there tends to be a bit of a negativity bias when we're forming impressions of other people or of organizations. And so if it could be a great organization with a great culture, but if there's some mishap and that's what gets in the news and that's what people end up hearing about or talking about, it could really very strongly color people's perceptions of the organization, even if it isn't an actually very accurate impression of the organization.
Okay. Shundrawn?
Well, I think of two words whenever I think of culture. First of all, I think of values, so shared values, what's important, what do we believe, and then behaviors. But I take behaviors secondly because it's accepted behaviors. And really, we act more on what we not cognitively know, but based on what we believe, right? And so I think that's important. So then the three things then that fall from that is culture is normative, right? It sets a standard for us to decide how we're going to act versus. It's actually prescriptive. It tells us, in a sense, what we will do or what we should do. And finally, it's also proscriptive. It tells us, in a sense, what we should not do or what we won't do. And so those things are kind of how I think about how culture comes and forms together.
Okay. Well, the thing that we really need to be talking about here, I guess, is problematic culture. And the big test for any organisation, I guess, that is looking at maybe fixing some inefficiencies or deficiencies in their culture is, how do you go about fixing it? Who wants to tackle that one first?
Well, I'll give it a go. It's a very tough one, though, and it's something. With my work through Melbourne Medical School, I do a lot of work with hospitals in Victoria around clinical leadership. And there are big cultural issues in our hospitals. And when a hospital has a bad culture, it trickles all the way down to the care that you get if you're in that hospital and patient safety. And that link is now really quite clear. And so the hospital culture tends to be very hierarchical, with senior doctors kind of at the top of the hierarchy, who traditionally have been able to kind of behave the way they want to, and talk to people the way they wanted to. And it doesn't mean everyone was behaving badly, but people were allowed to behave badly. And now there's a recognition that, particularly for more junior people in that hierarchy who are making the transition from med school into doctors with responsibility for patient care, which is a very tough transition, that the bullying and the nastiness and the lack of support that can happen in some hospital cultures not only makes things dangerous for patients, but it makes things dangerous for junior doctors. And research has found that young doctors have some of the highest rates of mental health issues and difficulties and distress of any profession. And obviously, we want them to be as healthy and as happy as they can be. So there is this recognition that we need to change the culture, and it's not that simple, particularly when you have such a complex organization with so many moving parts. But where I've seen it work the best is when it really comes from the top. That's the critical thing, is there are things people can do to percolate up a culture change from the bottom, from the coalface, but that's a long, slow, difficult process. Where you really see it happen quickly is when you get a new CEO or somebody comes in and says, okay, here's what's acceptable and here's what's not acceptable. In a sense, they're making the cultural norms very, very clear and very, very transparent.
Thank you. Shundrawn?
So there's an interesting quote that says, all bad men need to accomplish their ends are for good men to look on and do nothing, right? And so if you think about what people will refer to as a bad culture, sometimes we think in the extreme. There's something that's systemic that's affecting every single member of the culture. I think in reality, what you find often is there is some cohort, often a small cohort, that is actually doing things that are not only harmful to that entity, but to the stakeholders, but you have an organization that is complicit in that. In a sense, the proverbial many good men and women looking on and doing nothing. So in order to address a bad culture, I do think it starts from the top, but you have to have three things in place. One, you have to have strong and effective leadership to send those signals and set those standards. Two, you actually have to have engaged employees that actually care about the welfare, the well-being, and the reputation of the organization. And then finally, three, you have to have effective governance. Many of the individuals in this room reflect that and help ensure that in our organizations that we have good governance. But governance is more than just having a good economic end. It's ensuring those first two things, that you have effective leadership and that you have strong and positive partner and employee engagement.
Okay. Well, we also have an answer to this question from Graeme. Let's go to that.
Culture, like any organisational issues, starts at the top. The tone comes from the top. That means the chair, the CEO, the board of directors, the senior management, all of those are involved in setting the tone of the organisation, in setting its vision, setting its values, and importantly, and this is fundamentally important, ensuring that those values and vision are subscribed to by all people in the organisation, from the top right through to the bottom. Where culture fails is where those governing the organisation don't really believe in the values that they might have set out in writing. They talk about vision statements, but they don't really believe it. They talk about values, but it's not part of their DNA. It's not part of what they sincerely believe. And that message then starts to flow through the organisation right through to the bottom. It's reflected in a whole range of signs, remuneration structures that don't reflect the correct values of the organisation, the fact that those at the top will protest certain values, that the customer must always be put first, and then they will endorse or sanction activities that clearly don't put the customer first, or members of a superannuation fund, as the case may be. So the tone must start at the top. Must be a very visible chair, a very visible board, very visible CEO, and very visible senior management. All of them are saying these are the values of the organisation that we insist upon, and not only do we insist upon it, but those that don't subscribe to those values don't belong in the organisation.
So some very similar themes coming through there, I think. I'm starting to get quite a lot of questions coming through, so please keep them coming. Some great questions that hopefully I intend to get to. So let's move on. Does changing culture require external independent experts, or can it be tackled within the organisation? I'll start with you, Shundrawn.
Yeah, in short, I don't think it requires external experts. I do think, to the points that have been made, it requires strong and effective leadership. And I do think that you can absolutely benefit by having independent or external perspective. But one of the things that you need to actually be effective in changing a culture is a good understanding of the culture. So in some respects, if you actually had strong internal leadership that could provide or drive that change, it would in a sense be optimal, because you would also have a firm understanding of the culture.
No, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think there are some advantages sometimes to bringing in someone external without any preconceived ideas. Although I would say if you do that and you go through the expense of bringing in an external group, tell them as little as possible. Because if you want them to be objective and have a fresh perspective on things, the more you tell them, the more you're coloring their perceptions with your perceptions. So you might as well not even bother with the endeavor. And there's also, of course, I think there are huge quality differences in the different firms that do this sort of work. And so you might find yourself being very satisfied with what happens or not so satisfied with what happens. Look, I think a key thing that does help is measurement. So really identifying what are your key stakeholders and how do they perceive the culture? And what do they see as the right ways to behave? How do they see their behavior of their colleagues and themselves, and getting those measurements? Because it's very easy from any given spot in the organization to have your own perception of how things are actually operating, but you could easily have blind spots such that you're not really seeing what's going on in other parts of the organization. So I think the measurement part is important, but I think good measurement and good leadership internally should be able to do a lot for you.
All right, let's see what Graeme Samuels has to say.
You do not need a group of external consultants swarming over an organisation saying, we have got the solution to your culture, because that becomes the consultant solution. And as I've often said, culture comes from the top, comes from the board and the chair and the CEO and the management, and it is their values that are important. It's their vision that is important, and those within an organisation need to understand that and to accept that's the case. You bring a group of consultants in, they'll present their same old PowerPoint. If they're actually lazy consultants, they'll present a PowerPoint that's got the previous client's name still on it, and I've seen that happen once or twice as well. But I think what's very important is that if you're the head of an organisation, if you're the chair or the CEO or the board, and you don't know what the culture should be, or you don't know how to imbue that culture in the organisation, you've got to ask a serious question as to whether you're the right people to be leading the organisation.
Surely there's none of those lazy consultants in this room today. So let's move on to how individuals respond to culture. Commissioner Haynes said that remuneration should never reward individuals for doing the right thing, even if it means that the business loses money. Can you see a change happening in this space? Shundrawn?
Yeah, so that one's a little curious to me, but I'll say it this way. So first of all, if you think about external, what I call the external or extrinsic motivators, right? You have in my mind three primarily. Remuneration, so what people get paid and how they get paid. Recognition, people actually care about being recognized, right? And you have rank or status, right? The reality is those are not inherently bad. And it's not that, in my mind, the remuneration drives the culture. The remuneration is just reflecting what the culture values. And so a lot of times I think people actually are coming at the wrong end. They're saying we're going to, in a sense, fix the culture by changing the remuneration. And I'm saying the remuneration, if you tell me your pay policies, if you tell me how you promote people, if you tell me how you recognize people, I know a lot about your culture. And so it's actually getting to a point where you have what I call intrinsic motivators that can outweigh ultimately what's going to be important to people in those external motivators. So doing things like investing in people's professional development, making sure they have meaningfulness in their work, making sure that there are clear values like we talked about. And the last thing I would say on the values is organizations don't have values. People have values that they infuse in the organization. So when you can get the right balance of those things, I think you'll see it reflected in things like remuneration.
I think the point about values is very important. When I'm teaching leadership, and particularly leading change, which could include leading a culture change, a key thing is what your values are in leading that, but then also behaving in a way that's consistent with the values. And that could be, financial incentives for people, but it could also be, what do you spend your time doing in a meeting? If you value people helping each other out, do you ask during a meeting, what opportunities did you get this week to actually help a colleague accomplish something? If that's a norm that you want to infuse in the culture, then it has to be part of what you spend your time doing and what you ask yourself about. If you want to have a culture where people are honest about they don't know everything and they sometimes make mistakes, and the key thing is to learn from those mistakes rather than feel punished for mistakes, then you can ask in a meeting or just in a hallway, what mistake did you make this week and what did you learn from it? And often if you start with, here's the thing I messed up, and boy, did I learn from that, then you create a culture where instead of having this elaborate theater where everyone walks around pretending like they're on top of everything and they know everything, you actually have some honesty where people can talk about the mistakes, but what they're learning from it, and then that learning becomes shared learning. That kind of cultural shift can just happen because you model it. You ask those questions and you give some of those answers yourself.
Some practical advice, thank you. We might see what Graeme has to say too.
When we did the inquiry into the Commonwealth Bank, I've always said for those that are going to read that report, if they can't read 110 pages, simply take out the pages that relate to governance, culture and remuneration. Now, the reason I've picked those three is because the remuneration structures of corporations and of businesses can so often incentivise the wrong sort of behaviour, the wrong culture, or to put it in the double negative, they don't disincentivise the wrong behaviour, the wrong culture. And what we found throughout the Hayne Royal Commission was that some of the remuneration structures actually incentivised people within the organisation to do things that clearly has been labelled by Hayne, and I think by the community generally, as misconduct. Now, how has that happened? It's because organisations said, well, yeah, we put the customer first, but actually we don't, because we're going to remunerate you through the organisation for selling products that are duds. So my view is you pay executives and others within an organisation properly for doing the job they're expected to do. You reward people for doing an outstanding job, one well and beyond what is expected of them. And frankly, I don't like commissions.
Hear, hear. So you've already mentioned measurement. How do you measure and track a change in culture, I suppose, Jill?
Well, so what you need to do is before you start enacting any kind of cultural change programs, you need baseline measurement. So where are people now? How are they thinking now? So at Melbourne Business School, we got a new dean about a year ago, and one of the first things he did, and in his case he did bring in an outside agency, came in and measured people's views of the culture and people's work satisfaction and a number of different things like that. So that, and I think that was helpful to the dean to have that baseline as he's coming in, where is the organization? And then it allows you to set goals. Okay, well, we're doing well in these areas, but we have some weaknesses in these areas. What are our goals for improving? How are we going to get there? And one of the things that was done at Melbourne Business School that was very helpful is that everyone was invited to be on a big committee where we met once a month to talk about things that were going on in the organization. And that was another touch point for the leadership to understand what was happening in the organization. But that early measurement, because you can think you've gone through a whole change, and if you just measure at the end, you don't know actually what's changed, because you don't know where you were when you started. So you want to measure first.
Okay, Shundrawn.
Yeah, you hear the quip that you should measure what matters, but the converse exists as well. If you want to know what matters to people, look at what they measure. So it's interesting, people will reflexively say that culture is really important. So think about financial performance. We oftentimes measure quarterly, depends on the organization, sometimes it's monthly and weekly, right? If you think about if you're in an organization that is responsible or has a fiduciary responsibility around investments, how frequently do we measure investment return? And then you think about the key components of culture, which comes down to things that you measure around people, employee engagement and satisfaction. If you think about in organizations today, there is an increased discipline around measuring things like trust. You can measure that in an organization. And you can go through other things that are actually coincident with high and the effective cultures, things like diversity and inclusion. Now, what you'll find is those things don't get measured very frequently. And so I think that's one of the principal issues that we have, not only the fact that we need to measure those things, but the consistency in which we do it to get the feedback that we need to see, are we moving in our intended direction? Are we having effectiveness in those areas? And so that's one of the things I would really point out, and for all of us to think about in our respective governance roles as well.
Okay. Let's see how Graeme thinks we can move the dial in terms of measurement.
Hayne used an expression in one of his summations, if you like, of what the law should be. He talked about 6 principles, which are fairly obvious principles, obey the law, honesty, fairness, putting the customer first and the like. But he then applied what we also used in the CBA report for APRA, and that was the can we, should we test. The can we test is, can we do this? Is it legally possible to do it? The should we test is, should we really be doing it? How would we feel reading about what we're doing today in tomorrow morning's newspaper, the morning newspaper test? And it's a really important test. And it seems to me that the right culture is measured by our being able to say, we would not be embarrassed by reading in tomorrow morning's newspaper anything that we're doing in this organisation. In fact, we'd feel proud about it. That's probably the reason we won't read about it, because the morning newspaper won't write about it if it's something that's good. But it's a very important test, the should we test. And it seems to me that with all the ticker boxes that you might have, what ticker boxes do is they enable you to say, yeah, I can tick that box, it's all right. When if you really look at the overwhelming watermark that ought to be across everything you do, and that is, should I be doing this? Is this what I'd be proud of, or is this frankly what I'd be embarrassed about? Then if you can satisfy the proud of and not have to go through the this is what I'd be embarrassed about, it seems to me you've got the culture of the organisation right.
Okay. So, difficult question. How long do you think it takes to turn a culture around? Jill?
It really depends. It can take forever. It can be never. I mean, I've certainly seen organizations where they've had a number of tries and nothing's actually worked. And then you see things change very, very quickly. I was at a very interesting conference in medicine on diagnostic error in medicine. And we were talking about what things need to change in healthcare so that we reduce diagnostic error, which in developed countries is about the 10th leading killer, is mistakes in figuring out what's wrong with you. Because it's hard. It's actually a very difficult thing to do. And so the question is, what can we do to improve on that? And what cultural changes need to happen to help that improvement happen? And you can sometimes get this feeling that it's just cultures in big organizations, they're so huge, you're not going to change the direction of the ship. It's really difficult. And someone told a wonderful story about she was a nurse, and she was a nurse in the 70s, and she put some pictures up, and all the nurses are smoking at work. And then they're handing cigarettes out to their patients. Because that was the culture. That's what you did. You smoked near oxygen tanks, which is a little bit scary, but that's what people did. And then she was talking about how by the 90s, you wouldn't even think of doing that. You couldn't smoke inside a hospital. And so that was a drastic change that happened in a pretty short period of time, where back in the 70s, if you had said, do you think we'll ever have to stop smoking in hospitals? People would say, no way, that's never going to change. But it actually did. And I think when we do look at those changes, it can sometimes be helpful in our industry to think about if we were talking to someone 20 years from now, and we were saying, can you believe that back in 2019, we used to X, right? So can you believe that back in the 70s, it was fine to smoke with patients? Can you believe that when I was growing up, you could throw kids in the back of a station wagon, no seatbelts, and that was fine? In medicine, in 20 years, we might be saying things like, can you believe that doctors made diagnoses just using their brain without any tools? And I think it can be a helpful way to think about culture change and what needs to happen to make a change, and where would we like to go, by thinking, in 20 years' time, what will we be saying? Can you believe that we used to do X? I think that's a really helpful exercise. But sometimes things can change very rapidly. Sometimes they can take a very long time.
Shundrawn, what do you think?
I think that if we're saying fully transforming an enterprise, that can take a long period of time. But if you ask my clear opinion in terms of changing a culture from the standpoint going from a state where you had an unhealthy culture to a healthy culture, I actually think with the right level of leadership, the clarity of vision and mission, and the level of commitment, it can actually happen relatively quickly.
Yeah.
I fundamentally believe that.
Does it need a change of leadership? Do you need to bring new people in to change culture?
Well, it is most likely the case if your starting point is that you have an unhealthy culture. For sure, you have some level of failing at a leadership level, an engagement level, and a governance level. And so I'm not saying that the change in leadership has to come from without. It can be from within. But the likelihood that you're going to move from unhealthy culture to very healthy culture with the same leadership, the same level of engagement, and the same governance, the probability of that is extraordinarily low.
Okay. And I see you agree with that, Jill.
Yeah, and I would say, well, one of the things that can change culture quickly is what are the difficult conversations you're willing to have with people. So if it's been okay for people to treat other people a certain way or to value something over something else, and that's been okay, and then people get called out for that. So someone engages in a way of treating somebody else that's not all right, and a leader says, I saw that, that's not okay, that's not who we are. That can change culture really, really quickly. All you need is a few people to see that. Word gets around really fast, and people realize that things are different, and the way they used to be able to do things is now not going to be okay. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a new leader.
Right.
It could be the old leader with some new skills to actually feel comfortable taking on bad behavior.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge for people.
It's hard.
Holding people to account and not walking past, things that you really don't want to see.
Yeah.
Graeme Samuels has an answer for us too in terms of how long he thinks it takes to change a culture.
I chuckle when someone said that it would take 10 years. Someone said to me on a panel one day when I was addressing a group about changing culture, and they said it'll take 10 years. And I said the only people who advocate the taking of 10 years will be change management consultants because they've got a 10-year contract to do it. And it will also be boards of directors or chairs or the like who actually don't know what to do. And so they think, well, it's going to take 10 years. Now, I could say to you that culture can be changed very, very quickly. The first is by the organisation at its senior governance level saying this conduct will no longer be tolerated. And if the zero tolerance means that you will suffer serious financial consequences and potentially termination of employment if you engage in this conduct in the future. The second thing is that you must understand that this organisation is now focused on the should we test, should we do this test? And that's very important to the organisation. And your longevity of employment in the organisation and your ability to grow within the organisation to be remunerated appropriately will be you showing that you've adopted the values, the vision that we've set, and in particular that you can, with a completely clear mind and open heart, say, I satisfy the should we test in terms of everything I do through the day.
All right, so I have one more sort of prepared question before we move on to audience questions. To what extent does the governance structure of an organisation drive culture? And if we reflect on what happened during the Royal Commission, At the end of the day, it was the retail funds and for-profit entities that would have been referred for further investigation by the regulator. Profit to member funds with their equal representation models, while there's certainly some things for us to be taking on board, perhaps, is it maybe because of our governance structure and the fact that we put members at the heart of everything that saved us? I don't know. What do you think, Jill?
I think that definitely has made a difference. I think also that these funds have been under public scrutiny for a long time because you're held accountable for people's retirements and their well-being and so forth. And so I think it's been very public, and so it's been watched pretty carefully, and people know they're being watched pretty carefully. And I think where we've seen more of the problems are in places where there hasn't been as much oversight. So maybe some of that external pressure has been helpful, but it's probably also helped develop a culture and a leadership culture of we need to be very careful about what we're doing. And we need to put our customers in the number one position.
Shundrawn, I know you don't have a great deal of exposure to the Australian superannuation sort of governance structure, but what do you think?
Yeah, but certainly have familiarity with it. So I think that the structure here, and I would say I look at this across geographies. I mean, we're dealing with a business that's across the globe. So I think structure can be facilitative to ensuring that you have a strong culture, but I don't view it ultimately as the principal driver.
Okay.
Right? Certainly facilitative. Ultimately, it really has to be driven by the people who have the day-to-day responsibility for it. I think of it like having a healthy immune system. When you have the disciplines in place, whether it's sleeping well or eating well and those things, your immune system actually does what it's supposed to do. It keeps out the bad, things that would infect you. And when at times something does get in, it attacks it and removes it. So again, think of the structure as being something that can facilitate having, in a sense, a healthy culture or a healthy immune system, but it's not the principal thing that enables the responsibility.
Okay. All right, we asked Graeme Samuels the same question.
I think funds that have got a fundamental conflict in the way they operate, and particularly if they're dealing with both shareholders and members, have got to deal with that. That doesn't mean to say that retail funds should be banned or the like, but what it does mean is that they have an extra burden to deal with the governance issues of conflict on the basis that fundamentally superannuation funds should be acting in the interests of their members. That's their fundamental remit. And I think the Hayne Royal Commission drew some attention to the potential for those conflicts with retail funds to do some damage in terms of the ability to provide returns to members, which the industry funds escaped attention in terms of the Hayne Royal Commission, and I think that was his perception as to the difference between the two. What I think that fundamentally says is that when you're in any organisation, you always have issues of conflict, you'll have issues of culture, issues of vision and values, and it just becomes a responsibility, not a burden, but a responsibility on those governing the organisation to ensure that they're dealt with appropriately, because frankly the last thing that a superannuation fund wants in the future is to be subject to a cross-examination by Rowena Orr in another Royal Commission to say you didn't learn the lessons of the Hayne Royal Commission and you're back here again. And the fact that you're back here again means that we in government are going to have to start regulating in a different way that will hamper or inhibit your ability to actually be able to act in the interests of your members or shareholders, as the case may be.
All right, so moving on to audience questions. I've got quite a few on the app here, but if anyone wants to ask a question, please put up your hand. I'll start with this one. If you see poor culture in the ranks above you, how do you go about changing and challenging that? Jill?
That's a very, very difficult thing to do. And it's interesting because for decades in business schools, we have been teaching business school students ethical frameworks to help them deal with ethical dilemmas, which is how do you figure out if a given action is ethical or not? And if you use different sorts of frameworks that can help you navigate. But now it's really clear that, yeah, it helps them to have those frameworks, but the real issue is how do they speak up when they see something that they know is wrong? So that's not an ethical dilemma. You see it, you know it's wrong, but what do you do? And we see this with our students when they tell us their stories about ethical issues that they've faced before, where they know they're being asked by someone senior to do something that's just not right, but it's being framed for them as a way, well, if we don't do it, then we won't meet our numbers this quarter, then people will lose jobs, and then they feel like there's this trade-off that they have to make, and it's very, very difficult. And so now a lot of business school education is about giving voice to values. So teaching students actually through role plays and practice to sort of build the muscles of how do you speak up, because it's not something that most of us feel comfortable doing, and it's not something we can expect people to just do without training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shundrawn, what do you think?
Yeah, the only thing I would add in short to that is organizations have become better about having formal structures in place to do the proverbial raising your hand. And so if you see something that you really think is exceptional, but it is an issue, whether it's through a formal compliance structure or an upper or a higher level of management, you have to be comfortable raising your hand. Frankly, if you're at a point where you see something that you believe is systemic in the organization that you're part of, you have a different ethical dilemma, because that really gets to the question of, is this really the place that I can stay and thrive? And on the extreme, you may have to make a very different decision.
Okay. We can't ask Graeme Samuel a question because he's not with us anymore. Sorry, I was ready to go to the video. To what extent should culture be a consideration in merger due diligence? So there's a lot of pressure on our industry. There's still 200 funds in the system for fund consolidation. What role does culture play, I guess, in a consideration about merging two entities?
So from my standpoint, of all the considerations, culture is the most important when you're looking at a merger or a combination. And if you think about the success or failure of strategic combinations, ultimately it doesn't come down to did we do the financial projections wrong, or did we get the business model wrong. More than not, when there are failures, they are because of cultural mismatches. And so I think it's something that while we intellectually know is important, we probably don't still put enough importance on the cultural assessment.
Yeah, I think the research is pretty clear that the success rate of mergers and acquisitions is not what we'd like it to be. Now, I think this is an industry that has more experience at it and probably gets it right more than other industries, but the main reason why these things are difficult and they sometimes fail is because of the cultural issues. That you think of the synergies and things like that, but not enough thinking about the people. It is, however, an opportunity to generate a new culture. So a lot of times when there's mergers, part of the pushback is you feel like, especially if you're the smaller guy and they're the bigger guy, that their culture is going to become your culture and you don't feel comfortable with their culture. And so you get this kind of backlash. But it is an opportunity to sort of sit down and decide what kind of culture would we like to have and use that merger or acquisition as the time to start enacting that new culture. And then it's something new for everybody as opposed to one culture being imposed on the others.
So what about a situation where you decide your organisation has a pretty good culture? How do you then maintain that culture? So we've been talking about moving from a not so great culture to a more positive one, but what if you've got a good one? How do you preserve it?
I think you need to continue to be vigilant on calling out behaviors that aren't consistent with that good culture. Because we're human beings, we'll have bad days, but a few high-profile actions by people that don't get checked can really then influence what people think is okay to do. So I think it's being vigilant in making sure that people's behaviors are in line with what the cultural values are, but also realize that culture, even if it's a good culture, it still may need to move ahead and progress and change. And, you'll be bringing younger people into the organization. They have a different culture. The world is changing. So even with a great culture, you may still want it to continue changing, but in a positive direction.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think to the point, Jill, towards the end there, leads to something that I think you need to clearly establish, if you believe you have a healthy culture, what in a sense needs to be consistent, but you also have to be clear on what needs to change or evolve. So, for instance, in a culture, I think there are principles that you want to establish that should endure. If one of your principles, your load-bearing walls, is that we truly do put the needs of the customer or the stakeholder first, well, that's a fundamental principle that you would say, we want that to endure. But if you think about things that are aspects of cultures which frankly are either practices that can and need sometimes to evolve, or simply just our preferences, we actually have to be comfortable that to have a healthy culture, some of those need to intentionally change. And so I think distinguishing those things are important for having, over the long arc of time, a very healthy culture.
Okay. Shundrawn, we talked before this session about the values of Northern Trust. What's the difference, I guess, between values and behaviours, and what is it that you're really looking to measure? Is it the values or is it the behaviours associated with those values?
So I have a strong perspective informed by my positional leadership, which is you have to really start with vision and values. Because I think ultimately people come to a collective or some enterprise because of what they perceive or what hopefully is some compelling vision. And being clear about that says where we're going. But to this point that you raise about values, right? We have to say, if we're all coming together, while we individually have values, things that are important to us, things that we believe, what are the ones that we have or we hold in common? Because that becomes our social contract.
Yeah.
Right? And again, I say this all the time, as a leader, one of my most powerful tools is my voice. And so while I want to set an example in the sense of walking the talk, the very first thing I have to do is talk the walk. I have to send a very clear signal of what we value, of what we prize, of what will be rewarded, and that guides how people set standards and how people ultimately choose to behave. And so if we start at the back end trying to address the behaviors, we miss the most important opportunity, because I am well convicted that people ultimately, they don't act or behave based on, again, what they cognitively know. We got all kind of trainings on compliance issues and things like that for people to sign off and do something different. They do act according to ultimately what they believe. And so if we can, in a sense, in a constructive way, infect that value or belief system, we have the highest impact on our collective behaviors.
Yeah. And I think the key thing there is the clarity that comes with that. When you're able to say, this is who we are and this is who we are not, and you're able to translate that down into specific behaviors. Therefore, we do this and we don't do that. Where you see most unethical behavior happening is when there's a fudge factor, right, when there's ambiguity. Yep. So, when you're able to interpret a situation or view a situation in a way where you can get this thing that you want, but also see yourself as a good, moral, and honest person, that's where it's dangerous. And so if the leadership is able to make very clear, this is the line, and if you go over the line, then you're not being a good person, most people will police themselves. You can get a lot more out of clarity than you can get out of enforcement, because most people want to go home at the end of the day and feel like they've been good people.
So how often do you think does an organisation need to review its values? So, the values that were set up when the organisation was founded are not necessarily relevant in 2019. How often do you need to go through that process?
I think that depends a lot on the organization and how much things are changing in the industry. So in this industry, There was a big change last year, a lot of scrutiny and so forth. So this seems like really good timing to sort of have those conversations and be thinking about those sorts of things. Certainly there are industries where the pace of change is tremendously fast, high-tech industries and things like that. And so it might happen more quickly. But I think it really is very context specific. Maybe you have some more general ideas there.
Yeah. So from my standpoint, and this certainly reflects my own bias, I think you have to be really intentional. So if culture is made up of people, in our organization, we're adding new people around the globe all the time. Yeah. And so from my humble opinion, then you have to be engaged around these things consistently all the time. So whether it's things like our all-staff meetings where we're gathering our partners together around the globe once a month, at some portion of those meetings, we always touch on our vision, our mission, and our values. And not just repeating phrases, it's integrated into what we're communicating in very tangible ways. We give examples of things that we do that actually reflect the values. It's such an intentional part of the narrative. The way that I work on developing my own leaders is asking them on a regular basis in our one-on-ones how they're implementing those things into the conversations that they're having with setting the expectations for employees, how it reflects how they interview people. So I believe that it actually has to be systemic, and because an organization is constantly evolving, every time you add a new person, I don't think that you can just do it episodically.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. So a good question here. Most funds will say that they have a great culture, especially being profit to member. We feel pretty good about that. But are we all being naive? How do you recognise if you have a bad culture?
Interesting.
You want to start?
I'm going to let you take that one first.
Well, I would say, well, here's what it is.
Ready to go.
So there's a saying that goes, we all look in a mirror dimly, right? And so the reality is, as an individual, there's a distance between who I believe myself to be at any given point in time and who I am. And those around me can see that distance more clearly than I can. Well, that's true for organizations. And so the thing is, I think we can easily and all get caught up in the anecdotes of we have a quote-unquote good culture. So who wakes up in the morning and believes they belong to part of a place that's not a good culture? So I think part of what we have to do is turn the discussion on its head, and as opposed to saying we're generically a good culture, what we try and do is say, how can we continue to improve the culture that we have? Because I think what we can all accept is however good we believe our culture to be, that there are opportunities and room for improvement. And if we approach it that way, we don't have to get into the dichotomy of good, bad. We can focus on what are we consciously looking to improve and enhance every day.
I think also with complex organization, there can be pockets of very good culture. And if you're in one of those pockets, you think, oh my gosh, this is the best culture I've ever seen. But you could be in a different part of the organization, and there's bullying, there's unethical behavior going on, and that sort of thing. So I think a lot of it, this question of are we fooling ourselves is, you know, it may be too easy if right around us we're feeling like it's a good culture. Do we push ourselves enough to investigate what's happening in other parts of the organization?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So in response to that, I guess, can an individual, for example, railroad culture or derail culture?
Definitely derail. Yeah. Derail is easy.
I think if you have an individual that's in a significant position of influence, in particular positional leadership, it can have a very adverse impact in the culture. I also think that if you have a person in a very visible role, right, and they are engaging in behaviors that are inconsistent with what the culture says, it holds true in values, that's very detrimental. I would say whenever I've come into the leadership role, I recognize very quickly one of the first things that people are looking at is what am I going to do about the leaders that I have or I've inherited? I mean, because the culture knows, the people know. If there's somebody that's not, in a sense, abiding by the social contract, and the first thing that they're trying to assess is what are the rules of engagement going to be? And the first cue that they take is what decision or indecision you have around addressing things that are clearly outside of our values or norms.
Yeah. No, that's right. And that's what people are going to pay attention to is you watch someone do something, what happens to them? Right? Does it get ignored? Do they get told off? Are they rewarded? You know, what happens? That's how we define what the culture is what behaviors are going to give me higher status within the organization.
But that's something we struggle with, right? Those things are not always dealt with in a public way for everyone to see. You might have a closed-door conversation with someone and say, this behaviour was unacceptable, I don't want to see it again. But the rest of the team that may have seen the behaviour doesn't get to see how the leadership of the organisation responds to that. So how do you deal with that?
I think it's important for the leader to circle back to that group who are the eyewitnesses of what happened, and possibly everyone that they told, because when things happen, everybody hears about it. But, you're always balancing the privacy of the conversation you had with that one individual with what you expressed to the entire organization. But still, communicating to the organization that, we have recently seen some behavior that is just not on, it's okay, it's not okay, and we have addressed it, and rest assured, the leadership is taking care of these sorts of things. And if you see more of this kind of thing, we want to know about it.
I think if it's a public failing it cuts across an important value, I actually think there has to be a public address. Now, a public address doesn't mean that there's a shaming. A public address can mean that I dealt individually with that individual, and I encourage that individual then to go back and address the group and own up to that failing. But to have a public failing, to not go addressed, I think is to send the wrong signal to the organization about what you value.
All right, I think that's a great note to finish on. We've come to the end of our time. Can you please join me in thanking our speakers today, Jill and Shundrawn?